Hello. So these are the long-awaited results of the Slack survey for 2020 presented by myself, Michael W. Harris, PhD, and Catherine Palmisano, Doctor of Medicine. I'm going to run quickly through all of our slides. I will make the slides along with this video available, obviously, since you're watching this. And so let's get started. So we started off with our demographic data, and nothing is too surprising here, but I did want to highlight just how not representative of the US population is. I know we have many people in Slack not from the US, but I found it easiest just to compare this with the US data since I believe the vast majority are from the United States. Though that very question of how many are US residents and how many are foreign and where they are is a question we would like to explore in future iterations of this survey. So anyway, let's just run this down pretty quickly. So in terms of gender, we have 66% male, 30% female, 3% not preferring to respond, and 1% responding as non-binary. Whereas the general US population, as it is with the human population, the general population of humanity does skew just ever so slightly female. In the United States, as of recently, it's roughly 50.7% female, 49.3% male. As for age, as you see, the vast majority are in the age bracket of 35 to 44, which myself is a member of, with the next highest being 25 to 34 and then 45 to 54. In the United States population, it sort of breaks down as 15 to 24 is 13.27, 25 to 34, 13.9, 35 to 44, 12.8, 45 to 54, 12.4, 55 to 64, 12.9, and 65 and over, 16.4. And as you can see, we are completely not representative of this, but our breakdown does make sense when you start on the next slide and seeing when people actually started collecting. Finally, highest level of education attained. You can see the vast majority have at least a bachelor's degree, with 34% also having master's and 13% having a doctorate. It was actually this question that sort of prompted this survey when Kat and I were just tapping in a DM chat that's just like wondering how many people actually do have advanced graduate degrees in Slack, because just anecdotally, it seemed like there were a lot of PhDs, MDs, PharmDs, and other sort of doctorates or terminal master's degrees hanging around. And as you can imagine, the responses to the education question are completely not in line with the general US population, with only 3.4% of the US population having either a doctorate or a professional degree, 9.5 having a master's, 21.3 having a bachelor's, associates 10.3, some college 16.3, and high school is the highest level of achievement, 28.8. And I would think that probably a lot of the people in Slack who have either some college or an associate's are probably well on their way to getting higher and more advanced degrees, just in general from what I've talked when talking with people around, like how many people have aspirations of graduate school. So like once again, Slack is not exactly representative of the general US population. All right, next up, occupational data. This is where I think we can probably do a little bit better cleanup with data. Essentially, this was a fill in the blank question because we really had no idea what people might be saying, but we took all of your responses and put them into a word cloud. We did do some cleanup, collapsing similar responses to group them together. But as you can see with, for degree, a lot of computer science, English, business administration, a lot of engineering degrees as well. You can kind of see, obviously, if you're familiar with word clouds, the larger a word appears, the more responses. And computer science, a lot of you around here. Us information and library science people need to do a better job of representing. I know there's a number of us out there. And as for current occupation, software developer, which I guess it is kind of interesting considering this is such an analog, stationary, heavy hobby, and yet our two biggest responses in each of these areas actually relate to digital, which may or may not be maybe logical, but it is definitely an interesting response. So there's a lot of responses in here, and you can sort of dig into those by looking. And if you do want any more sort of like breakdown of this specific data, any of this data, we can provide completely anonymized version of things. But it's both interesting and not surprising, and yet a little bit surprising how all of this broke down. So next up, let's talk about our responses to the pin hobby. There were a couple of you who had some questions about why didn't we ask about relative value of your collections and such. And just as I said in a thread on Slack when this question came up, why we didn't collect this data, Kat and I did discuss it, and we both decided that whereas that might be an interesting question for some, I know for myself, I'm not exactly comfortable answering that question publicly, even though I don't exactly have a very valuable collection. But we didn't want to turn off anyone. And if people are interested in that, I would say find like-minded folks and collect that data on your own. But we were not interested in that. We were in this for fun, and that's kind of how we got these. That's how we decided on the questions we did ask. So it's interesting that for the sort of year that people began collecting, the vast majority are, well, relatively new since 2011. The two biggest categories were 2011 to 2015, 37%, and 2016 to present, 34%. That is a full 2/3, almost exactly 2/3 of people came into this hobby roughly 10 years ago. And then we get into the really fun questions of how much time do you spend on Slack per day? Looks like most of you are healthy with your Slack habits, unlike me. 34% saying less than an hour, and 38% saying 1 to 2 hours. 6% saying 2 hours, a big dip, 2 hours plus. And then 19% saying more time than my boss knew about. This is my personal response. Please don't tell my boss. And then 3% saying from dawn till dusk. In collection size, again, this is not exactly surprising. The vast majority of you are somewhat healthy, being either 20% with 10 to 30 bottles and samples, or 15% with 31 to 50. That seems a pretty healthy size. Then a big jump there with 51 to 100 at 29%. And then we start getting into the people that we all know who they are. We see their names at the top of the leaderboards on Fountain Pen Companion. I won't name names. I used to be one of them. Then I started shedding my ink collection because I didn't need that many. But yes, 11% with 101 to 250, 14% 251 to 500, 500 to 1% with 7%, and then 3% saying I lost count 10 orders from Van Ness ago. I used to be like that. And then your actual collection size, again, most people are fairly healthy in responses. 10 to 20 pins, 18%, 21 to 30 to 18% as well, 31 to 40, 12%, and so on and so on. Most of us have fairly relatively tame collections. I myself is in that 51 to 100 at 20%. But again, it's kind of interesting to see that how this all breaks down. There are definitely people out there who are the collectors. Some of those are the users, and seeing how all this breaks down. And that might be something that we ask in further iterations of this is how do you actually perceive, are you collecting or are you using a little bit of both? But again, this is the first iteration, and this gives us a good baseline for what we would do in future surveys. All right, so non-fountain pen usage. So this was where we asked you about your standard uses. Looks like the vast majority of people use rollerball. Oh, I forgot to mention, overall responses, number of 154. So that is the sort of our baseline, especially for once we get into these numbers, where we actually have the numbers of responses per. So vast majority of us use, and this was all, you can choose all ones that you use regularly. So rollerball and gel are vastly the most popular of non-fountain pens, with ballpoints coming in last. Most people prefer mechanical to wood case pencils. I did find that a little bit interesting, since wood case pencils are a little bit more collectible in how you do them, or maybe that's just how I perceive with Blackwings. And then with standard pen brands, this one's a little interesting because it was hard to differentiate between what is sort of the refill versus what is the sort of sleeve, if you will, for the refill. And we might want to do a little bit of cleanup with that, but a lot of people like just Pilot regular pens, Retro 51, of course, very popular. Uniball, that's my pen of choice, Uniball Signal 307. And then you can see the others over there. with how we did them. I do think there was maybe some confusion with how we categorize these, but again, this is the first iteration, and I think we can probably break into this data a little bit more closely. This was an interesting question. We asked like what blogs, what podcasts. We actually didn't ask blogs, but what podcasts or YouTube channels that you listen to regularly. Obviously, with podcasts, the Panatic podcast, how we all sort of came here was number one, with Tokyo Inklings, one of the newest on the blocks, coming in second, followed by the Bent Tines. I'm not sure if that was maybe a little nod to Cat on this, but yes. And then Nib Section, Fountain Pen Companion, and a number of others coming. I was really happy to see a lot of people putting in the others. This gives me some more to link to listen to. I'm not going to butcher that, but the Spanish language podcast started by Dr. Jeffrey Coleman, along with his co-host, whose name escapes me right now. Stationary Cafe, which I just listened to the friend of the show episode with the founder of that, and I'm definitely interested in going to check that out probably. And then with YouTube channels, Mike Madison coming in number one, followed by Figboot on Pens, number two, SBRE Brown, the Google Pins coming in after that, and a lot of others that was filled in, including Incantadora, Pen Addict himself, Watsky Squirrel, Inky Rocks. A lot of these, once we started looking at the responses, Kat and I both did sort of a face palm and like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we forgot that one. And we both sort of agree that some of these would actually be higher had we remembered to include them. So sorry to everyone that we accidentally left out. But it was interesting to see the responses with all of these. Nib preferences. A lot of you had questions about why we put music in grind as opposed to nib. Yes, that was an oversight. We needed to move that. And probably the biggest face palm of all is that in favorite grinds, we forgot to put the SIG in. So, but luckily a lot of you wrote in SIG, so it does represent there with 8%. As for favorite nibs, it seems that most of us are in the medium to fine category, with EF15 double broads being 10, broad being 13. So 2/3 of people like their nibs either really fat or really small, but most of us are pretty middle of the road with our nib preference size. Insert joke here. As for grinds, a lot of you don't grind your nibs, but as for those who do, Architect Cursive Italic seem to be in the lead, with stubs coming after that. And then a lot of write-ins for the Mark Bacchus hybrid grind, Gina's journaler nib, Pendleton BLS, oblique italic broad, one person wrote in. But yeah, so kind of all over the place, but that's the interesting thing with the grinds, is that you kind of find what you like, and that's what you kind of evidently go into. And with that, Architect can probably be on the extreme end of a grind, with Cursive Italic being more on the reserved side of it. But that's what makes grinds interesting. Of course, 18% of you do not want people touching your nibs, and I respect that. All right, moving on to the next. Other hobbies. So this was interesting for a lot of us. I tried to list, and Kat and I tried to list all the ones we can think of, but a lot of you had some really good answers that we, of course, were like, oh yeah, we should have put that in. Actually, the other was by far the most common response, but we did also ask for all that applies. So coffee being number one of the ones that we actually had, cooking, baking, then coming bags. After bags, watches. Wearing my SKX right now because it's the weekend. Knives, knitting, home brewing. So a lot of different kind of hobbies, but for the other that people wrote in, video games was by and large the most number one popular choice, followed by photography, reading, brewing tea, running, music, writing, hiking, gardening, woodworking. You can look, there are a lot of other hobbies in there. Mechanical keyboards does get a small shout out. I figure that one might be rising up the ranks if we do a round two of this in the near future and include it. But a lot of different interests around there. And I think when we first listed it, we tried to go by what the channels were in Slack to see where people might be interested in things, but obviously there's a lot else going on. All right, finally, the question to end all questions: to post or not to post? Pocket pens and pins designed to be post notwithstanding. And thankfully, Slack is overwhelming in its response. Slack has spoken. 68% not post pins, 32% do. That is definitive victory for the non-posters. We have spoken. If you post, you are wrong, according to Slack. But that's okay. We accept all here. But that was obviously just a fun question that we wanted to ask, especially based on the friend of the show podcast that has been going out right now. We'll see what Brad thinks about these results, and we will be forwarding this to him just so he can have some fun with it and see what it is what we've done. Anyway, that is the last question. Thank you for watching. Thank you for your participation. And hopefully in the coming year, we will do a round 2 with refinements to it. So thank you very much and have a good day.